Hello, everybody. I am Sandra Lee, and I have a guest expert on with me today. This is Julie Turner. She is a co-founder and owner of oGoFloat, the float center here in Penticton, where I live. And I met Julie at a networking group and found out about her float center. I had previously floated down in Olympia, so I went to try oGoFloat, and I have been continuing to go ever since. If you read my article and if you've seen my post this week, you know that I'm always thinking and turning off, letting go of stress and stuff like that is an issue for me. So I really appreciate having Julie's float center here where I can go and then just like tune off. My brain still does its thing, but it's just good for me to get out of my house, away from the computer, away from my work, and to have a designated time to check out. And so I really appreciate Julie and oGoFloat for that. If you have questions for Julie, then post them in Facebook. I'm going to, glance over and check that every once in a while so that I can ask Julie the questions that you have. Okay, Julie, I am sending it to you.
All right. Thanks so much, Sandra. Thank you for having me. It was so lovely to meet you. And I liked having that connection when we met that you'd floated at oGoFloat in Olympia. They were good friends of mine that owned that one. And I had such great experiences there. And I love the center. So I knew I had big shoes to fill when you were coming to float here. So thank you for appreciating this and continuing to come. It's been wonderful. And I appreciate you very much for coming and consistently and floating. It's been great. Yeah. So, I mean, I own a float center. I guess at this point, it's becoming a lot more common, but I guess I should start with just what is a float tank, right? Uh, a float tank, it's like a huge tub with less than a foot of water and nearly 1,000 pounds of Epsom salt. So you float totally weightlessly on the surface, like a cork, right? And it takes all the pressure off your spine and your joints and your muscles, and you just float completely freely. It kind of feels like you're floating through space in a way. The goal of the float tank is to reduce your sensory input. So the idea is no lights, no sound, no sense of touch. And you just float completely weightlessly in nothing. And that was when Sandra asked me to be a guest expert. I was like, oh, goodness, what am I an expert in? Like, that's kind of intimidating to be considered an expert. And I was like, I'm an expert in nothing. I spend a lot of time practicing doing nothing. And so, yeah, I can't, take full credit for that hook. The people down at Float On in Portland have shirts that say "experts in nothing," and I really like that. So I wasn't the first to coin it, but it felt appropriate here. So yeah, so then I just started thinking about what is nothing and what is it that I practice and what it means to me to spend time in nothing. And so I've written my article there about nothing. The way that we perceive anything is through our senses, right? So through, your sight, your sound, your touch, your smell, your taste. In the float tank, like there's a smell from the Epsom salts, but it's pretty neutral. And please don't be exercising your sense of taste in the float tank. That's not a good idea. And then, of course, that you're floating the buff. So there's nothing touching you, which is one of my favorite parts about floating is having as we're sitting here in the seats or the floor and the clothes and the everything, there's always something touching you, right? And especially if you're a mom of young kids, you often have a kid hanging off your hip. There's always something or someone touching you. And to have that experience where that you're just completely free is that's probably one of my favorite parts about floating. Of course, there is options to have sound in tanks. So sometimes people will listen to a guided meditation or something like that. But in my experience, silence is usually kind of optimal for me. And the light, of course, is there optionally, but I usually turn that off pretty quick and dive into my nothing as fast as I can.
But for people who are uncomfortable with that, there are options. So
Absolutely.
I listened to somebody talking on a podcast about what floating is, and she was most comfortable actually when the lid was cracked. So it's like it depends on what each person is comfortable with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's such a adaptable, malleable practice to each person, because every float practice is going to be different. It's going to be unique to you. And the benefits you receive are going to be unique to you and what your body is needing, right? So the whole thing is very adaptable, whether it be, listening to music, or, there's a variety of tools and that you can play with, like the pool noodles. I know Sandra has fun with the pool noodles and the float tanks, and, there's different stretching. Just because you're doing nothing doesn't mean you have to be, completely still and not moving. There's a lot of opportunity for stretching and really getting in tune with your body. It's a really great place to have a conversation with your body. Sometimes, you'll get an ache or a creak or something that's, feeling weird, or a tingle that you're like, where's that coming from? And if that sensation had come up while you were at the grocery store, you probably would have just toned it out and not listened to it because you were busy doing something else. But in the float tank, when everything else is taken away and it's just you and your body, oh man, there's so many unique conversations you can have in there, and like you can actually like just ask yourself, like, hey, toe, how you feeling today? And and really check in and dial in. And when it gets so quiet, I mean, one of the first things you hear is the sound of your breath and your heartbeat. And another thing that you don't necessarily hear when you're in the grocery store, but to dial in and to hear those and to have that connection with your body. And I mean, I love when it gets so quiet that you can hear yourself blink. Like, that might sound crazy, but you can absolutely hear yourself blink in there. So
and let me tell. So things that I notice when I'm in the float tank is where I have muscle tension, where I'm holding. And it's a big awareness piece because, like Julie said, normally I'm busy doing something. And so that level of sensation is normally just part of the background that gets no attention whatsoever. And so this whole balance between tension and releasing, tension and releasing. And then she mentioned about the pool noodles and things like that. So what do I use them for? So it's like I find that I have tension in my neck if I don't use anything to support my head and my neck in the float tank. So I have an arrangement of these tools that Julie suggested to me to use it in a certain way so that my body really can just relax and not have that tension. But it's like, what do you do with a pool noodle? So just to, I have one underneath my knees and I have one underneath my head and my neck, and I've got it all figured out.
Yeah, as the tools can be really helpful, especially, or if somebody's working with an injury or an ailment, sometimes they might need additional supports in places. I find like people with whiplash have different requirements on their necks and stuff. So we have different tools. Sorry, I'm just grabbing some tools here to show you that you can use in different ways to support that. So, we have just like regular old pool noodles. And so like Sandra was saying, she can use it behind her back, or sometimes I'll put it like up my spine, kind of arch over it. Kind of feels really nice. So there's a lot of different stretching that you can get in there with those. And yeah, they definitely have their time and their place, and they're wonderful. But there is no way around it. They are causing tactile sensations. So it is still, a little bit away from maybe what I would call the traditional sense, but it definitely time and place. They're great.
So who benefits from floating?
I mean, in my opinion, everybody would. Like I said, the benefits you receive are quite unique to you. The science, what the clinical studies say, the science was started in the 1950s. I guess I'll start there. So that's why float tanks were invented, was the whole idea of what happens when we don't have any sensory input, what happens when there is no light, no sound, no sense of touch. And, the rumors back then were that, it would drive you mad and you would go crazy if you didn't have sensory input. But what they found was the complete opposite, and they got all these huge benefits. So the first thing they noticed right off the bat was a reduction in blood pressure. And so that's been repeated over and over again in the clinical studies. And one of the most recent ones that they did with anxiety, they found that the blood pressure reduced within 10 to 15 points within the first 10 to 15 minutes of your float. So it was a pretty noticeable effect. And it was widespread against pretty much everybody that floated. So that was interesting. It's been clinically shown to reduce stress and burnout. The stress one has been repeated many times. Anxiety has been one that they've been working on the last few years, there's been a few studies come out where they were showing that people with anxiety were benefiting from floating almost twofold over the quote regular people. So it was really fascinating, and they found a huge decrease in state anxiety and a decrease in muscle tension. And actually, the decrease in muscle tension was greater in the anxious population than in the control group. And the release of muscle tension was greater than the reduction of anxiety. So one thing that the researcher said is, like, if I was coming at this from a different perspective, I'd be researching how much the muscle tension is contributing to the anxiety. Like, there's a huge connection there. So that wasn't the focus of his study, but he was commenting how that would be really interesting for somebody to look into a little further. The other really cool thing I found about that study is the increase in overwhelming state of well-being and also serenity. And I love that serenity was used as a marker for the studies. And so across the board, everybody experienced this increase of this feeling of serenity. And the feelings lasted. So they gave them like a phone or whatever and pinged them, after 4 hours, 6 hours, 12 the next day. And they found that the benefits of this were lasting well into 5, 12 hours, some people into the next day, some people even 30. There's one person that even said 36 hours later. So when they're talking about this population of severely anxious patients, and they spend an hour or 90 minutes in the tank, and they're having this extreme benefit that's lasting almost a day, a lot of those people are prescribed and are on benzodiazepines. And the average lifespan of that is 4 hours. So if they're taking benzos every 4 hours versus a float that could, have them be good for a whole day, and that's just one float. Who's to say, the people that float a lot know what happens when you float consistently and over time and how that affects your long-term anxiety. But so far, those studies are still premature. So those are some, like the physical pain, the blood pressure, but you don't have to be ailing to benefit from floating. Like, there's a lot of athletes that use floating. Almost every professional sports team now has a float tank somewhere in their studio. So that's really encouraging. A lot of the Super Bowl winners now are all floaters, and Tom Brady floats, and so it can also be used for just human optimization, right? So whether it be you're set on a goal, maybe it is a sports, or maybe it's learning a new language, or if you have something that you want to incorporate into your daily life, focusing on it or using the tank can really help. So just overall, I think it can help like everybody in some way. But I understand it takes practice. Like I understand that not everybody is super stoked about the idea of doing nothing, right? Like when I talk to different people, like I'll hear some people that'll say, there's kind of like two different camps of common things I hear is like, oh, I could never shut my brain off. I could never be alone with myself for that length of time. And then the other camp, sometimes they'll be like, oh, that sounds boring. And like, because I've been floating for so long, sometimes it is hard for me to remove myself and go back to that very first floater before I even knew what floating was and try to relate to that. It's just been so long. Sometimes I have to really consciously do that and be like, what are you talking about? It's great. Like, but I can pull myself back, and I can remember times in my life when I could have easily said either of those things and been like, oh, that sounds boring, or oh no, I don't want to be stuck with my own thoughts for that long. And I mean, that might be right for them. That might be true for them at that moment, but I really don't think that's an overall truth, because your brain is never going to shut off. Like, there's studies now that show that your brain, even after you've died, it will continue to fire for X amount of time. Like, your brain's not going to shut off. That is not the goal. And trying to fight it is just going to, that sounds miserable. trying to shut off your brain like that. That's not the goal. It's not going to work. So I don't think that should be the intention by any means. And then the boring part is, for me, it's just not boring at all. Like, it's just always a new adventure in there. There's always something to learn. There's always something that my body wants to tell me, or something that I really just need to think through. And maybe my mind does need to run and really think this thought all the way to the end, and to see it from different perspectives and how it's going to affect other areas of my life. And then I've thought that thought through, and I'm like, okay, now I can move on and do something else. Like, it doesn't have to keep bugging me for days and days on end if I can just float on it and be like, okay, thought it through.
So I have a question. It
Yes.
sounds like it can benefit anyone, from normal people to people who want to accomplish things to people who have, health issues and post-traumatic stress and all of that. So, is part of the benefit for people who are on the more extreme end, the people who have post-traumatic stress or who have, health issues and things like that, is it that it just reduces stress because stress contributes to all of the conditions, or is it something different from just reduction of stress?
I mean, there's definitely going to be a few things. The reduction of stress, of course, anything that ails you is going to be exacerbated by stress. So, reducing that is going to help anything and everything and everybody. There's also, they've shown that it resets, like it recalibrates your nervous system, right? Because your nervous system is what takes in all this information and then then you react to it. That's your fight or flight. That's how you deal with every situation that you're ever in, how you interact with your environment. So that's an aspect as well, is just like that complete downtime and turning things off. And then it's like when your computer doesn't work, well, turn it off and turn it back on again. And I think the same works for humans.
Talk a little bit more about the 90-minute cycle.
Yeah. So in flow centers across the world, there's a big, I don't know if a huge difference, but there's a variety of different time slots that are offered anywhere. Some people do as little as 30 minutes. And then some people sleep in the float tanks, right? Some people have done, I had a guy here the other day that was 5 hours in the tank. So it's not, you don't get pruny. That's another thing about floating, because there's so much Epsom salt in the water. The actual molecules of water are so bonded and they're so fat and they're so big that they can't permeate through your skin barrier. So that's why you don't get wrinkly and pruny from floating, whereas you would a bath if you were in there for 5 hours. Sorry, I trailed off with the pruning. Where
90 minutes.
90 minutes, right? So for us, we've settled on, and we feel really good about 90 minutes. And we do this for a few different reasons. The biggest of which is that your REM sleep cycle works on 90-minute intervals, but it's not just your REM sleep cycle. Actually, your pain tolerance, your appetite, all these things, where your attention span too, all work on 90-minute intervals. So they've done these studies where they'll put people in a room and they'll get up to get coffee every 90 minutes. Like that's just kind of how your body operates. And in your REM sleep cycle is one of the biggest evidences of this 90-minute cycle. And so when you fall asleep, there's this 90 minutes where your brain is just like barely active, barely doing anything. And then after 90 minutes, it gets into this huge spike when you hit your theta state. So that's your REM sleep cycle. So that's when you get those dreams, lucid thoughts, all those things. And then your brain comes right back down. So, and then it's another 90 minutes. And then you got a bigger spike of REM sleep. And so it's going to last a little bit longer. And then when that's done again, another 90 minutes, it keeps going. So you go through about 5 or 6 of these cycles each night. And each time your REM sleep gets a little bit, that cycle gets a little bit more. And that's why when you wake up, that dream that you just had is the most vivid because it was the longest of the entire night and obviously the most recent. So for us, it kind of just made sense that like, if there's this, your brain seems to need this 90 minutes of nothing to have this great something. So for us, the 90 minutes of nothing is that's why we've chosen 90 minutes and why we feel it's really the sweet spot. There's a few other reasons too. I mean, for one, like, you deserve it. You deserve 90 minutes to yourself, like, take it. But there's no rules of floating. Of course, if you want to get out early, do so. Some days, it's just, that's what you're feeling. And, you float for an hour and you're like, I feel good today. Great. Like, there's no rules, right? We just want to make sure you have at least 90 minutes of time. Yeah.
So what's the process? Tell people what to expect when they go float.
Sure. So usually you'll book online or have some sort of reservation process, and you'll have a waiver likely saying that you don't have epilepsy or a heart condition, things like that. We want to make sure that that you're not going to be a danger to yourself in the tank, right? Because you are in there, by yourself. And if you did happen to have a seizure, not a good time for that. So, if it's under control with medication, then you should be fine, but something to think about. So once you've, read through all the procedures and signed your forms, you'll likely be shown around the space and into the float rooms. When you go into float, you'll shower before and after. The before showers just wash away all your dirts, oils, creams, anything that you brought in. And then you climb into the tank and play with lots of positions, play with the tools, rest, whatever, close your eyes, open your eyes, listen to your blinks, whatever is you're feeling that day. When the time is up, usually some music or some lights, some indication will come on and let you know that it's time to get out. So then you just head back into the shower. The solution is really slippery, so you'll want to be very cautious. And then in your after shower, you'll just wash away all that salt and then go about your day with your post-float glow.
Yeah. It's pretty straightforward. It's easy, taken care of. So it's like one of the things that I think a lot, and it's like, okay, so what time is it? And I'd be worried about what the time was. And Julie assured me that it's like, don't worry about it. I'll just let you know. Sometimes I'm still thinking so much that I do get up early. Sometimes it's just because it's like, nah.
Mm-hmm.
But that's me. But it's beneficial. I still go. I still take the time. It's like it's as an important an appointment as any other appointment.
Yeah,
Self-care.
I mean, and every float is different, right? Like I've, floated hundreds of times and it's always a new adventure. I never really know what I'm going to get myself into. Like, sometimes I do go in there with the intention of like, this is what I'm going to think about, or this is my meditation today, or whatever it is. And sometimes that goes well. And sometimes my brain's just like, no, you're not doing that today. This is what we're doing today. Like, it's just always different. So that's what kind of makes it a really neat practice. I mean, most things that our practices do kind of have that tendency too, but yeah, it's just continually changing. So it's, to me, it's the furthest thing from boredom. It's there's just so much happening in there, and so I benefit greatly. I mean, and there's there's tons of benefits as well that aren't necessarily clinically studied, like pregnant ladies. Pregnant ladies love floating. Like if you are used to being a tummy or a back sleeper and you haven't been able to lay on your stomach or your back, there's nothing better than a float tank. Like you can rotate full circle. Yeah. Another thing that my pregnant ladies love is like using the pool noodles and like really releasing their hips is something that they can do in there that they can't do on the floor or when they're subject to gravity. The concussions is a big thing. And of course, it's more and more frequent and becoming more and more well known. And usually the prescription that they tell you for a concussion is go find a quiet, dark room. And I have a pretty darn quiet, dark room. So I've had some people in that have some great success stories. I know fellow flow center owners that got into this because they had a brain injury and used the tank to heal themselves and wants to share it with others. So there's lots of things that the science hasn't caught up to. Never mind just like the Epsom salt feels great for your skin and your hair and all those things. There's also, I touched briefly on like say epilepsy. There's very few people that like wouldn't do well with floating or that would have problems with it. I do have a page on my website all dedicated. It's called Who Shouldn't Float. And it's a pretty extensive page, and it's not to scare anybody away from floating, but I just want to give everybody all the knowledge they need. So if there's anything that you're concerned about, like another thing, sometimes it's just lifestyle choices, like fresh tattoos are a pretty big no-go because of all that salt, it'll sting. And fresh hair dye is a no-go because I don't want the fresh hair dye in my tank, and you don't want to lose that beautiful $100 worth of color that you just put into your hair. So there's a few other things that have nothing to do with medical that are reasons why you might want to hold off on floating or find the right time to do it. So if anybody has any questions about that, I would direct you to our website, which is ogofloat.ca, and find the page about who shouldn't float.
If you have any questions, wherever you are, there's probably a float center not too far from where you are. And I'm sure, just like Julie, you can contact them and ask any questions that you may have. I imagine any of the facilities would be willing to let you come in and do a tour, tell you what to expect, show you what the room looks like, because they're all different. So oGoFloat in Olympia, their float rooms are very different from what Julie has set up here in Penticton. So, just kind of like go around, check it out, see if it's something that you might be interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people now in the, in this post-pandemic world. I put a video up on our website with a whole walkthrough at the center and the tutorial. I put it up there, I mean, for people to know and have information, but also just less time that I spend talking face to face to people just as a safety measure. And so a lot of other float centers have done that as well. So, you know, just type in the name of your city with the word float tank after it, and the nearest thing will pop up. I'm sure they will be nice people. We're a pretty close or tight-knit group of float center owners. So if you can't find something, give me a shout. Maybe I can find something for you.
And if you're concerned about disinfection, Julie was ahead of the curve, because as owner of a float center, she's cleaning everything all of the time anyway. All of the time.
Yeah, I have to go to Sandra to get her to work on my trigger points from my scrubbing arms. Yeah, no, I mean, float centers have always been really, really clean places. Like, we depend on it, of course. And a lot of because it's such a high density salt solution, some of it it replicates like the Dead Sea, right? And the reason the Dead Sea is called that is because nothing wants to live in super salty waters. So we've already started with a pretty good starting base with a solution that is not habitable to most pathogens or anything else. And then, of course, we have strict clean procedures. We were disinfecting long before it was cool, which was good because I had a bit of a stockpile when everybody else was running out. Yeah, so everything is disinfected in between the tanks, and the tanks have these huge robust filtration systems on it. So between each floater, the solution, it goes through the filtration system and is thoroughly disinfected through there. Yeah, I also have a blog on my website about cleanliness of float tanks. So I go through step by step and just explain all the things that we do. Yeah, we float here too, right? So it's a self-serving mission to keep it as clean as possible as well.
Yeah. So you want to let people know how they can connect with you?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm located here in Penticton, BC, but guaranteed there's a float center somewhat near you. So I recommend you look out to wherever you are and see what you can find for some salty waters. If you want, get in touch with me. I'm at oGoFloat.ca. I've got all my contact information on there. You can catch us on the socials. We're just at oGoFloat. And I'm happy to answer any questions, whether I've had questions come in, like, I have a few different blogs that get attention. Sometimes, you know, people are searching strange things, and like another popular one is my floating while female, like all the things to know about vagina owners and floating. And so I've gotten emails from like Ireland and like strange places just because somebody came across my blog and had further questions that they didn't necessarily want to ask their local person that hosts their float. So I'm happy to answer anything if you want. Did Facebook have any questions?
Nope.
Okay.
But that's okay. People will watch after, and so post them if you have questions there, and Julie will get them. Well, thank you, Julie. It's been wonderful having you on as our guest expert.
Thank you so much.
Tomorrow, what is Thursday Tips for Thriving tomorrow? I do a Thursday Tips for Thriving that is related to the topic, and I realize that I don't know what I said my topic was going to be tomorrow. What am I talking about? I am talking about, supporting memory and mental clarity. So on Tuesday next week is my next biofield tuning group session. And so I'm going to talk about memory and mental clarity, which is the subject of the next group biofield tuning session. And stress relief is a big part of how to take care of this whole mental clarity piece. So tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific, I'm going to be talking for half an hour about memory and mental clarity. And this is actually my final guest expert. I am moving on to doing other things, but it has been wonderful having this series of guest experts, bringing people to you to help you be healthy, happy, enjoy your life. So thank you, Julie, for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And Julie's information will be attached to this video, as well as it's been with all of the posts that I've been making associated with this all week. So thank you. Go float.
Absolutely.
Thank you.